Hey everyone, and welcome back to another dive into the past. The terrifying truth is that some of history's loudest disasters begin with the quietest bureaucratic apathy. If you went looking for the American dream in 1919, you'd find a good chunk of it sloshing around in a giant black steel drum on the waterfront of Boston's North End, specifically on Commercial Street. This wasn't just any drum. It was a behemoth, a 50-foot-tall, 90-foot-wide, cylindrical monument to industrial necessity. It belonged to the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA, through their subsidiary, Purity Distilling. Now, why a tank this size? Because Purity needed an almost unbelievable amount of raw molasses. And not for pancakes. This was the dark, sticky, industrial-grade stuff, the kind you ferment to make ethyl alcohol. This alcohol, in turn, was essential for the booming wartime economy, used in everything from munitions, think explosives, to, yes, that most American of pastimes, manufacturing rum. So, this monstrous steel can, holding over 2.3 million gallons of thick, sugary liquid, was basically the engine room of a post-war industrial complex, a kind of sweet, slow-motion time bomb. Imagine standing next to it. It held the equivalent of about 140 million cans of soda. It was a giant, uninspired steel silo completely out of place next to the cozy, century-old tenement buildings of the Italian immigrant community, which was, incidentally, right next door. And here's where the history gets painfully, boringly predictable. From day one, it was a problem. The year was 1915. Construction had been rushed, slapdash, and, in retrospect, criminally cheap. The tank itself was built by a man named Arthur Gell, a company treasurer with absolutely zero engineering experience. Let me repeat that. Zero. His qualifications were apparently limited to managing money, not structural integrity, and his solution to the 2.3 million gallon problem was simply thinner steel, faster assembly. We're talking rivets that didn't quite fit and steel plates that were simply too thin to handle the internal pressure of all that dense, viscous goop. It was the architectural equivalent of using duct tape to fix a submarine. Almost immediately after it was filled, the tank began to groan and leak. The USIA management, in a stunning display of corporate negligence, knew. They absolutely knew. Residents in the area, mainly children, would even collect the leaking molasses, the black gold, in buckets and cans. It was a local curiosity, but behind the childish scavenger hunt was a horrifying truth. The tank was weeping. It would often drip so much that the base was perpetually coated in a sticky film, and when it was warm, it would ooze a terrifying dark brown trail down the street. It was literally a ticking bomb that sweetened the sidewalk. When locals complained, when they pointed to the huge spiderweb cracks in the seams, the company did the 1919 equivalent of putting up a nothing to see here sign. They simply painted the tank brown, which, makes it blend right in with the molasses, thus hiding the leaks. They were more worried about the cosmetics than the catastrophe. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When is something not just a minor, messy inconvenience, but a structural failure waiting for its cue? Because out on the Boston Harbor, a single, ordinary day was about to become the most tragically, uniquely sticky day in American history. And that day was Wednesday, January 15th, 1919. The temperature had been ridiculously, unnaturally cold for days. But on this morning, the weather did a complete 180, jumping from 2 degrees Fahrenheit to a balmy 40 degrees. 40 degrees in January isn't exactly beach weather, but it was enough of a spike to get things moving inside that colossal, overstressed tank. The North End was having a pretty good day. It was lunchtime, and the neighborhood was alive with its usual hustle. Draymen were moving cargo, children were just getting out of school, and workers were grabbing a quick bite. Over near the elevated railway station, a group of maintenance workers were taking a break. A few blocks away,
A small team of firemen were eating at the station. Everything was normal. Everything was boring. Until it wasn't. At exactly 12:30 p.m., the giant steel tank exploded. Not a slow leak, not a rupture, an explosion. It was so violent, so sudden, that the sound was heard for miles. People described it as a machine gun firing or the deafening crash of a train derailment. For the poor souls living right next to it, the sound was the last thing they ever heard. Imagine the scene. 2.3 million gallons of molasses, that's nearly 12,000 tons of sugar and water, released in an instant. The force was astronomical. The flimsy tank walls disintegrated, sending shrapnel flying. But the real horror was the wave. A wave of dark, thick, brown sludge rose up, an estimated 25 feet high, taller than many of the surrounding buildings. This wasn't water. This was an incredibly dense 11.7 pounds per gallon liquid, and it moved with terrifying speed. Initial estimates put the speed of the wave at 35 miles an hour. 35 miles an hour is fast enough to knock over a concrete column, let alone a human being. In a horrifying split second, the wave consumed everything. It flattened the wooden buildings of the Purity Distilling Complex, literally reducing the city public works stable to kindling. It ripped a firehouse right off its foundation, turning the station into a splintered coffin for the firefighters inside. It even knocked an entire steel-elevated train off its tracks, a feat of liquid brutality that defies belief. One witness, a 10-year-old boy named Tony DeStasio, later recalled, "Molasses 3 feet deep covered the street and covered the sidewalks." But it wasn't just covering things, it was crushing them. People were instantly swept off their feet, trapped and dragged into the thick, suffocating tide. And here's the kicker, the truly messed up detail. The victims weren't just drowning. The molasses, warmed by the tank and the sudden temperature spike, hit the cold winter ground and almost immediately began to cool and thicken. This was a flash flood that quickly turned into quicksand. If you were lucky enough to survive the initial impact, you were now struggling against a liquid that was rapidly setting like cement. The screams were muffled by the viscous goo. Horses, trapped in their harnesses, bucked and panicked, their struggles only cementing their fate. People watched in helpless terror as their friends, neighbors, and family members were slowly, stickily entombed. It was a disaster that was both ridiculously unique and brutally efficient. You could survive a fire, you could run from an earthquake, but how do you outrun a tsunami made of candy? The initial shock had passed, but the deadliest phase of the flood was just beginning, and this sugary tomb was not giving up its victims easily.
It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Dying in a molasses flood. It feels like something straight out of a 1950s B-movie comedy. But the sheer physics of the situation turned this sugary disaster into a genuinely terrifying killer. This wasn't just a sticky mess. It was a non-Newtonian nightmare. The key to the molasses lethality was its density and its temperature. Inside the tank, the raw, freshly delivered liquid had been warmer than the Boston air, likely somewhere around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe more. When that warm, heavy mass hit the 40-degree street, it experienced what scientists call thermal shock. It suddenly cooled, and molasses, being a non-crystalline sugar syrup, immediately became exponentially more viscous. It went from a fast-moving wave to a near-solid obstacle course in minutes. Think of it like this. A regular tsunami is made of water. Water is light, and once the wave passes, it drains away. But molasses, it's 1.5 times denser than water. To put that into perspective, imagine trying to lift a 10-gallon bucket of water versus a 10-gallon bucket of molasses. The molasses is significantly heavier, stickier, and far harder to move through. Now imagine being trapped in the middle of that.
You're submerged in a substance so thick that every single movement is a Herculean struggle. The density meant that the pressure on the chest was immense, making it incredibly difficult to breathe, even if your head was above the surface. Victims weren't just drowning, they were being crushed and suffocated by the weight of the syrup itself. But wait, there's an even darker scientific footnote to this tragedy. The molasses also had an incredibly low thermal conductivity. That's a fancy way of saying it's a great insulator. When people and horses were submerged and trapped in the cool, thickening goo, the molasses effectively sealed them in, preventing their body heat from escaping. For those not crushed immediately, this led to rapid hypothermia. They were encased in a heavy, inescapable sweet shell that slowly sucked the warmth right out of them. The rescue effort was an absolute catastrophe because of this awful physics lesson. The first responders, the lucky few firefighters who weren't instantly killed, had to wade through chest-deep syrup that behaved more like wet clay than liquid. Their boots became 20-pound anchors. Moving just a few feet was exhausting, and the sticky resistance was relentless. They couldn't run. They could barely walk. They had to literally chip away at the setting goo to reach the victims. It took 4 full days to confirm the final death toll. The sticky carnage had swallowed up 21 people and injured over 150. And here's a truly ghoulish, absurd detail. The force of the blast and the subsequent wave had scattered body parts and debris so widely that some remains were never positively identified. You had bodies flung hundreds of feet away, some even swept into the harbor and found days later. All because of a sugar rush gone wrong. The sheer awful absurdity of the event is what makes it stick in the mind. A major American city, crippled not by fire, nor by flood, but by a product most commonly used to sweeten desserts. And as the city began the impossible task of cleaning up this biblical mess, a much bigger question arose. Was this really an accident? Or was someone trying to hide something darker behind the brown facade?
The immediate aftermath was pure, sticky chaos. We're talking about an entire neighborhood entombed in a 5-foot layer of molasses. Over 300,000 gallons of harbor water were needed just to wash the goo back into the harbor, turning a stretch of the Boston waterfront into a temporary, murky, sugary swamp. It took days for the true recovery effort to begin, carried out by teams using saltwater hoses, shovels, and sheer, frustrated grit. But the cleanup wasn't just physical. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, the owners of the disastrous tank, immediately launched the kind of frantic damage control that only happens when someone realizes they're financially liable for a sticky tsunami. Their initial defense? German saboteurs. Remember, this was 1919. World War I had just ended, and the fear of German agents was still very real. The USIA, completely ignoring the mountain of evidence that the tank was leaking like a sieve, floated the theory that anarchists or enemy agents had planted explosives to destroy the molasses, which, they pointed out, was essential for the war effort's munitions. It's the perfect corporate distraction, isn't it? Blame the invisible foreign enemy rather than your own cost-cutting, unqualified company treasurer, Arthur Gell. The media ran with it because sweet tsunami caused by bad math doesn't sell as many papers as evil spies blow up sugar. But the local community, the working-class families who had to live with the stink and the fear, weren't buying it. They had complained for years about the ominous rumbling and the constant drips. They knew intuitively that this was about greed, not gunpowder. And here's where the investigation truly starts. The state appointed Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, an auditor and former judge, to act as a master to hear the evidence in the resulting lawsuits. This wasn't quick. This was a 6-year legal slugfest. Over 125 separate lawsuits were filed against USIA, seeking around $1 million in total damages.
That's roughly $18 million today. The proceedings involved nearly 3,000 witnesses, because everyone in the North End had a sticky story to tell. It became the longest and most expensive negligence case in Massachusetts history. The company tried everything. They even tried to prove that the day's sudden temperature spike, that jump to 40 degrees, was an act of God that they couldn't possibly have foreseen. As if a responsible engineer wouldn't design a tank to handle a 38-degree temperature swing in New England. It was laughable, frankly. But the defense completely crumbled under the weight of one undeniable fact. The math didn't add up. Expert testimony revealed that the steel used in the tank was too thin, and the rivet seams had failed a simple stress test by a factor of 3. The tank was structurally unsound from the day it was built. Arthur Gell had never even bothered to run a proper stress analysis or hire a qualified engineer.
After 6 grueling years, Colonel Ogden delivered his final ruling. And here is where the Molasses Flood truly changed American life, moving beyond absurd local tragedy. Ogden found USIA responsible, unequivocally, ruling that the company was liable for the damages. This was a landmark moment. It was one of the first times in American jurisprudence that a major corporation was held financially responsible for a disaster caused by clear negligence and shoddy engineering. Before this, companies could often hide behind legal loopholes or simply blame external factors. The Molasses Flood case set a precedent. If you build it poorly and it explodes, you pay. USIA ultimately paid out over $600,000 in settlements, the 1925 equivalent of millions of dollars. The money was distributed to the families of the 21 victims and the 150 injured survivors. It wasn't enough to bring back the dead, but it was a crucial victory for accountability. But the legacy wasn't just about money. The disaster led directly to profound changes in building codes and inspection standards, first in Boston and then across the country. Suddenly, engineers had to submit plans that were actually reviewed by other engineers. Imagine that. Tanks, silos, and other industrial structures were required to undergo hydrostatic testing, a simple process where a structure is filled with water to test its strength before the catastrophe. It's a boring regulation, sure, but it's a boring regulation that keeps 2.3 million gallons of industrial syrup from drowning neighborhoods. And here's the wonderfully weird, almost folkloric part of the legacy: the smell. Despite the city's massive cleanup effort, involving thousands of gallons of water and sand and workers picking up debris for months, the molasses proved impossible to completely eliminate. It had soaked into the soil, seeped into the basements, and adhered to every crevice of the brick and granite streets. For decades afterward, long after the legal battles had settled and the city had rebuilt, on warm summer days, locals swore they could still catch a faint, sweet, fermented scent wafting up from the ground. It was the ghostly aroma of 12,000 tons of rotting sugar. It was Boston's quiet, embarrassing secret. It was the smell of bad engineering and mass tragedy. Imagine trying to explain that to a tourist today. Yes, this charming historical district occasionally smells like burnt caramel because of a corporate cost-cutting measure 100 years ago. The area today is dominated by parks and modern buildings, but the site of the original tank is just a paved lot near a small memorial plaque. The true memorial, however, is the history lesson. Sometimes the thing you think is the most boring, structural integrity and bureaucratic oversight, is the one thing standing between you and a deadly tide of sugar. And sometimes, history leaves behind a faint, stubborn sweetness that reminds us the bitter lessons are never fully washed away.